Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in December, so quick mini reviews of everything that I finished reading in the month. I had a really successful reading month in terms of quantity. I read 20 books, and I will sort of asterisk that with the fact that a lot of these books were quite short. I read a lot of like little Christmassy books, and towards the end of the year, I realised I'd read 146 books. I was definitely going to finish two more books, so I was like, how about I just squeeze a couple of short ones in as well and round it up to 150. Because this is quite a large wrap up, I will put timestamps down below in the description for when I talk about particular kinds of books. So I'm going to start with the adult fiction because I think that's what most of you are interested in. Then the younger fiction, YA and children's, then non-fiction, and then poetry at the end. The first fiction book I finished in the month was The Last by Hannah Jameson. This is meant to be a post-apocalyptic like thriller kind of book. It follows a man named John who is in Switzerland for like a conference, and while he is there are like nuclear war attacks on America, and basically like everything starts shutting down. Like there's no internet connection, there's no phone signal. Some people decide to leave the hotel they're staying in to try and find somewhere else. John is someone who decides like, we may as well stay here. It's just as likely someone will come along and find us and help us than we are to find someone if we go looking. He's grappling with the fact that he doesn't know what's happened to his wife and children, and he didn't leave his wife on like very good terms. This book follows on several months after that nuclear attack, as they stay in this hotel, as they are waiting, as they begin to develop a microcosm of society among like these 20 or so people that are still left in the hotel. And also, someone in the hotel has been killed, so they know that someone amongst them is a murderer. This book should be so creepy and so thrilling, and I just didn't think it was. I didn't really connect with any of the characters. I don't have a problem with them being unlikable, which they are, but you at least have to be able to connect to them in some way, and I didn't get that with anyone in this book. I wasn't invested in finding out who the killer would be, and I actually found the ending of this book really unsatisfactory. John's a massively unreliable narrator as well, which I think sometimes can be a really interesting plot device because you don't know if you're getting the full... You don't know how accurate their version of events are. The book is told through him like chronicling it as like a history, but also like that narrative framework didn't make sense, because if that's what he was doing, he wouldn't be writing in the way that he is. Maybe if you're into this kind of like dystopian mystery kind of thing, this isn't a genre that I would necessarily gravitate towards. Maybe if it's something that you tend to like a bit more, then you might like this. But I don't think this is going to be one that I'm keeping hold of. I will probably be getting rid of this very soon. Next, I read The Braid by Letitia Colombani. I really enjoyed this short novel that follows the lives of three women that have very different experiences and backgrounds. We have one woman in India who is part of an untouchable caste who wants a better life for her daughter. We follow another woman in Sicily who is grappling with her father's waning health and her role in the family business of making wigs. And then finally we have a woman in America who has a very high-powered job. She's a lawyer, and she faces a lot of like pressure because of that, and she's also a mother of three, and her story is a lot about how she balances both of those things, being a mother but not wanting to be judged in her field by being a mother. Each of their stories is handled so delicately, and it's really just like opening a window to these women's lives for a short space of time. All of these women are connected by their desire for a freedom and their desire for more than what they have. And the way their stories are woven or braided together at the end of this novel, I thought was really subtly, gently, and just very beautifully done. It's beautifully written. There are some stunning lines in here. If you are interested in reading about women's experiences, then I would highly recommend this one. I read Peach by Emma Glass. Huge trigger warnings for like so many things in this book, from like sexual assault, which is a main one in this book, murder, animal abuse, just general, like there's lots of really like grotesque, gross, stomach churning things in this book. So it's super visceral. If that doesn't sound like it's something that you would get on with, maybe avoid this one, but I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure I always understood it, and I think this does warrant a second reading. This follows our main character Peach in the aftermath of a sexual assault, and it follows her grappling with trying to understand what that means for her now. In a way, it kind of follows her spiraling, but it's told in this like really surreal way that we're not always really sure what's going on and what's real. I think if you like Emer McBride's books and like Jeanette Winterson's books, this is kind of somewhere between the two of them, in that it's got like that fast-paced stream of consciousness thing that you get with Emer McBride, where things are very like intimate and visceral, but it also has like that Jeanette Winterson magical realism, slightly unsure what is actually going on thing. I think it's really interesting because some books you love for the characters, some books you love for the plot, some books you love for the writing style. Some books have this thing where it just gives you an experience and you can't quite put your finger on what it is about that experience that was so gripping. And that's kind of how I feel about this book, and that's why I do want to reread it. And it's such a short book as well, like you'd easily read it in a day like I did. Some books just kind of grab you and they take you on a really fast whirlwind and you just have to go with them. And that's how I felt with this book. I thought some of the author's ways of describing things, while they seemed quite violent and visceral, they actually really hit home with me. It's a very uncomfortable book, but if that sounds like something you'd be into, I would definitely give this book a shot. I finally did it, guys. I finished Daniel Deronda. I've been reading Daniel Deronda by George Eliot for fucking ages now, and I've been on a whirlwind with this book. This book has a wall in it, and what I mean by that is around 250 pages, you have to make a choice. Are you going to carry on with this fucking massive book or not? And I hit that wall. I hit that wall hard, and I was considering giving up, but I didn't, and I'm so glad I pushed past the wall. This book mainly follows 3 different characters. So we have Gwendolyn, who is someone who really wants the finer things in life. She is really in pursuit of a luxury life of riches, and I love a female character like that in a classic book. I think Gwendolyn is so cool. I don't always agree with her, I don't always like her, but I enjoy her. We have Daniel Deronda, who is a young man who is unsure of his lineage and heritage. And if you've read any George Eliot books before, that is a theme that comes up a little bit, I think. How much are our identities formed by, you know, our relatives, our ancestors? How much of our identities are forged individually by ourselves? Is that something that comes from within, or is that something that is shaped externally by the society around you? Our third character is Mira, who is a Jewish singer who Daniel meets when she is going to kill herself. Kind of a love triangle between all of those characters. A huge amount of this book is about the Jewish experience as Daniel learns more about Mira's background, but also about his own background. There are literally no surprises about Daniel's background. Like, it's so obvious. I don't know if it was like meant to be obvious. Basically, like the whole book, people are like, "Hey Daniel, have you ever thought you might be Jewish?" Turns out he fucking is. I can't speak to how accurate that portrayal is of the Jewish experience or how Jewish people were looked upon at this time in history. But I learned a lot about the Jewish experience from it, I think. In saying that, there are just like huge passages in this book that are full of musings on philosophy and different approaches to the world, and they're the bits that are a struggle to get through. Honestly, it does feel a little bit like George Eliot may have done loads of research into Judaism and she just wanted to put all of the research in this book. If you've read a George Eliot book before, it's most likely that book was Middlemarch or The Mill and the Floss. And I think if you did like those books, then it's definitely worth giving Daniel Deronda a go. But like, I didn't enjoy or get as much out of it as I did those 2 books. I do gradually want to work my way through all of George Eliot's books. So the next one on my list is probably going to be Silas Marner, which fortunately is a lot shorter than this one. The next book I'm going to talk to you guys about is The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas. What a surprising little novel this was. This book follows the friendship and bond and love between 2 young girls as they progress through their education together, but they also have this fascination with this place called the Ice Palace. Basically everything is centered around this Ice Palace, and the Ice Palace is almost a character in itself. It's like it's living and breathing. The way the author describes the Ice Palace is beautiful, and it is glittered with metaphors. You can choose to unpick those metaphors in quite an analytical way, or you can just like let them take you. I feel like you almost move through this book like a glacier, you know, slow moving, pushing through. What appears beautiful on the surface is actually doing so much work. The friendship between these two main characters is very intense. I think they're in love. I really think this book has some of the best description that I've ever read, and it was just a thoroughly fantastic reading experience. And I would highly recommend it to anyone. I've not really heard anyone speaking about this book, and I think it's just beautiful. Next, I have Ghana Must Go by Thais Selassie. I really enjoyed the last half of this book. The first half of this book, it took a lot of time for this book to find its feet, I thought. This book follows a Nigerian Ghanaian family in America in the aftermath of the father in this family being wrongfully dismissed from his position as a surgeon. Rather than face up to this, he decides to move away and essentially like abandon his family. And the book follows the family coming to terms with that and trying to unravel the mystery of where he is and what's happened to him and why he chose to abandon them. His abandonment fractures the whole family, and that was something that I found really interesting to read about. If I'm being completely honest, I think this book could have done with a tighter edit. There's a lot of over-explaining. I think parts of it are really like overwritten as well, while there are parts that are beautiful. Like for every bit that I thought, oh, that's a really like fantastic way of phrasing something, there's another bit where I'm like, there's no need to dress up this sentence as much as you are doing. I think this is a debut though, so I would still be really interested to read anything else that this author comes out with. If you are interested in reading about like splintered families, living in different parts of the globe and learning a lot about different cultural experiences, then I think this would be a really great pick for you. I also read The Man Who Didn't Call by Rosie Walsh. I read this when I was travelling from London to Dublin for Christmas, and I just read it like when I was traveling to the airport and like on the plane. Completely devoured it, and I thought it was so good. This book does something so impressive, and it like rarely happens, but when it does, I love it. But I'll go back and tell you what the book's about. So this book is about a woman who's like, she's in her like 40s, I want to say, and she has this like whirlwind week-long romance with this guy, and then he goes on holiday and they're like, we'll meet up when you get back, it's fine. And then like he disappears, he's like off the grid, he won't reply to any of her messages. Her friends are like, come on now, like it sucks, but he's ghosting you, like he had his week of fun and then that's it. But like our main character is convinced that's not the case, and like she hasn't made up this connection, and there are just little things that he does that doesn't make sense if he was planning on disappearing. And all the while our main character is exhibiting the kind of behavior that I think a lot of us exhibit when we first start seeing someone, where we kind of just stalk to the depths of the internet, which, to be fair, as women dating men, we need to make sure you're not serial killers or like Tories, I don't know. And as she digs deeper into this, it gets more mysterious and more things start to not make sense, but then they start to do make sense. And what this book does that I love is that there's a twist and you think you figured out that twist, and then that thing happens and you're like, oh, that's kind of annoying, I figured out the twist. There's another one, and it's an even better one. I thought this book was great. This book was just so entertaining. I loved it. Now moving on to the books for slightly younger readers, I have a couple of YA books to talk about. I read Slay by Brittany Morris. This book was so entertaining as well. This book follows a 17-year-old girl who is one of the few black kids at her school. She's very interested in like race relations and that kind of thing, and how they impact her life, and she sets up this like MMORPG. A serious flashback to being 15 when I said that, but it's like this fantasy online role-playing game. Really celebrates a lot of different facets of black culture, whether it's like Caribbean culture or the vast array of like African cultures that there are. But things get very complicated when an online dispute in this game spills into reality and a young boy is killed because of it. No one knows that our protagonist is the creator of this game, and a lot of the book is her figuring out what the fuck she's gonna do. It's also got a lot of the like quintessential things you would expect from YA, her developing her sense of self, her sibling relationships and her friendships, and how differences of opinion cause fractures in friendship groups. It follows her romantic relationship and the strain that's put on that. How there are different ways of being an activist. My only criticism of this book is that I think there was like too much description of the fights in this book. Like, in most things, when it comes to an action scene, that's when I kind of start to like shut down. It was fantastic. It was a book that really left me thinking, and I think it's probably one of the best YA books I've ever read. I finally read Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman, and let me tell you, I devoured this book. This book is so fucking good. And I realise this is not a new opinion. I realise I'm very late to this party. This book follows the friendship and romantic relationship between two characters, Sephi and Callum, and their story takes place in a world that is full of racial divides. In society, people of colour have the societal advantage. People of colour have like the power, and Sephi is from quite an influential black family. Callum is white, and it's about the fractions in their friendship, relationship. Their society becomes so unequal that it seems impossible for them to get through it. What was a really uncomfortable reading experience for me was how I really had to like retrain my brain like properly. Like I kept imagining Sephi as a white girl and Callum as a black boy when that's not the case. Like I had to retrain my brain. But it's also just like a really thrilling read. Like it is so gripping to find out what's going to happen to these characters as things get like more high tension and more dangerous, and people are, you know, starting to turn to violence as a form of activism and defense. This book is part of a series, and it very rarely happens to me where I'm like, read one book in a series and I know I really soon want to read the next book. You have the next books in the series, so I don't think it will be long before I read the second book. I also read Wondersmith by Jessica Townsend. This is the second book in the Nevermore series. In the first book, we followed our main character, Morrigan, who in the lead up to her 11th birthday, she thinks she is cursed. She thinks she's going to die because of that curse. Instead, she is whisked away by this magical man named Jupiter North, and she learns more about her magical abilities, goes through a series of like trials and tribulations to become part of the Wondrous Society. Now, at the end of that book, we learn something more about the powers that Morrigan may or may not possess, and this book follows on from that. And I can't really tell you much more about the plot without like spoiling the first book. I don't think this book was as strong as the first book, mainly because I feel like there were fewer set pieces in this book. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of moments that I remember from the first book, and I read the first book a year ago. I like bookended my reading year with this series. There are a lot of bits in that book that I still really strongly remember and like stand out really vividly in my head as like the bit where, because they were just so fantastical and magical, and I felt like this book had fewer bits like that. But I think that's something that happens a lot with second books anyway, and I still thought this book was so magical, so thoroughly entertaining. Really cinematic book, like you can really visualize everything that's happening in this book in your head. Middle grade fantasy is the kind of fantasy that I really love, so I'm really excited to read the third book in this series. The final book I have for younger readers is The Lotteries More or Less by Emma Donoghue. I had read some of Emma Donoghue's adult fiction. She's probably most well known for Room. But I'd never read any of her books for younger readers before, and this book is just fantastic. The Lotteries are a blended family made up of 7 kids, 4 parents, 1 grandparent, 5 pets, all living in the same house. You know, the parents are 2 couples, 2 same-sex couples, so we have like 2 dads and 2 moms, and like that's not made a thing of. And that's really what I would say about the entirety of this book. Like there is so much diversity and inclusivity in this book, just seamlessly woven in, and it's never made a thing of. This book just follows them on their Christmas as things go slightly wrong but somehow pull themselves all together, as Christmas often does. This book also presents education in a really fantastic way. All of the kids are homeschooled, and the parents kind of see like their entire life as an opportunity to teach these children about lots of different things, and they educate in a really like friendly, non-intimidating way. Not only about the things that are kind of seen as like the building blocks of education, but also like so much about cultural stuff, which I think is fantastic. If you are looking for a kids book that is packed full of diversity, this is fantastic. To the non-fiction, I read Notes on Camp by Susan Sontag. This is made up of 2 essays from the 1960s that are about like arts and entertainment, and the main essay is about the nature of campness. It explores what campness means, about why people would choose to like perform themselves in this way. It briefly explores like the link between homosexuality and campness. It looks at key figures from history who were very camp, like Oscar Wilde comes up a lot. I don't think I really got this book. I think if like you were looking at campness in like an academic scenario, then this would be a really useful resource for you. But I just found so much of this book, I was like, what is she on about? In recent years, I've become like really jaded by the conversation of like what is art? What does art mean? Like, I can't be fucked anymore. But if you are someone who is like interested in exploring the nature of art, and especially campness as a subsection of art, then I think this would be a great thing for you to read. Like, I don't think this is bad. I think I just like wasn't in the headspace, and I wasn't in like an academic or analytical headspace. I think a lot of what Susan Sontag is saying is probably actually really interesting. It just wasn't right for me. I also read The Booby Trap, which is edited by Donald Porter and has a bunch of different contributors, including Caitlin Moran, Patrick Ness, Jamila Jamil, Sarah Cox, Benjamin Zephaniah, Jenny Eclair, a bunch of different contributors, and I didn't really like this book. But again, I think it's a book that just wasn't for me. A lot of this book is like really short essays. Some of them are like short stories. Some of them are just like anecdotes about boobs, which I thought I was going to love. But this is very much for like, I think, young teenage readers, because a lot of these like anecdotes and essays basically come down to, I used to hate my boobs and now I don't anymore, the end. Which I think maybe would have been really useful for me to hear when I was a younger reader, like someone who has no boobs. And like that was a big thing for me when I was a teenager. I was like, when am I going to get some tits? So maybe this would have been really great for me to read when I was that age. But now I was just a bit like, I'm not getting anything from this. I didn't think there was like a lot of nuance in this book, is what I'm trying to say. But it didn't sell me nuance. I wasn't told that this was going to be like a really fantastic feminist piece about boobs. I put expectations on this book that I shouldn't have put on it, when ultimately it's just a slightly lighthearted book about boobs.
Hi, Editing Leanne here. With so many books in one wrap-up, it was inevitable I was going to forget one. I missed out 'Twas the Night Shift Before Christmas by Adam Kay, which is a non-fiction book that is made up of Adam Kay's diary entries from when he was a junior doctor. You may know his previous book, This Is Going to Hurt, which is a book that was on my favourite books of the year last year. I thought it was phenomenal. I thought it was both hilarious and heart-wrenching, and it was a book that really resonated with me and came to me at a really like important moment in my life. And this is a collection of some of his festive diaries from his time as a junior doctor, and like his first book, it really outlines the tremendous strain that is put on junior doctors, particularly at this time of year where a lot of people are celebrating and enjoying themselves. They are working, and yeah, I think if you enjoyed Adam's first book or you got something out of it, then I would highly recommend this one. I found it just as funny and heartbreaking as the first one. Anyway, back to the video.
I also listened to They Don't Teach This by Eniola Aluko. Eniola Aluko is a lawyer. She is a black woman. She is a former professional footballer. This book is basically her life story, but particularly focusing on those different aspects of her life and the intersections between them all. It looks at her growing up and her developing an understanding of her race, and it follows her education journey and her professional journey in football. It follows the struggles that she faced as a female footballer, you know, a sport that is massively underappreciated and underfunded, although things are changing, but particularly as a black female footballer, and any prejudice she faced because of that, especially like internally within her own teams. Eniola was a very prominent voice in coming out against a former England coach for his exclusory and racist behaviours towards her. I really appreciated hearing about that from her perspective. It was really interesting to hear about how she used her skills as a lawyer to advocate for herself and her fellow sportswomen. It looks at the huge lack of security that female footballers face at the absolute top of their game. They can so easily have their teams and their sports have their funding cut. I thought this book was really fantastic, and I'm a huge supporter of women's football. I love football. Like, football is my second love after books.
If you are someone who's also interested in women's sport, then I think this is a
really fantastic read. Okay guys, we're almost at the end. We just have the poetry books to talk about now. And these three I will whiz through very quickly. I read Caroline Duffy's Pablo Picasso's Noel, The King of Christmas, and Frost Fair. Every year, Caroline Duffy brings out a little poetry book for Christmas. Frost Fair was the one that she released this year. And they are basically like little poems, little stories about Christmas. The King of Christmas follows a baron and baroness when the baroness suggests that the baron appoint a king of Christmas to fulfill the stately duties over Christmas, and I found it a lot of fun. Pablo Picasso's Noel is a really charming one that follows Pablo Picasso and his dog on Christmas Eve, but really is about the community of people that they encounter on that day. And I loved Frost Fair, which follows, I think it's called the Great Winter, which happened in the 1600s, where the River Thames in London froze over. And lots of people like camped out on it, and there was loads of like fairs and stalls set up like on the river. I had no idea that this was a thing that happened, so I loved learning about it in this way. I always read a couple of these around Christmas time, so I would really recommend them. But, Christmas has been and gone, so I feel like you don't need more Christmas recommendations. I also read another Carol Ann Duffy book. I read Selling Manhattan. If you have heard me talk about Carol Ann Duffy before, you'll know she's one of my favourite poets ever. But a lot of what I've read from her is her more recent work, and this is only her second collection. So it was really interesting to see the history of her work. This collection has a lot of things you would expect from reading her other work, but is not the place that I would recommend that you start. I think places like Rapture or The World's Wife are much better places to start with her work. But it's really interesting because you can see like a lot of things that you would recognize from her other work in this. Like, it's really punchy. There is a lot of like wit and snark in there. Two of my favorite poems were An Old Atheist Places His Last Bet. And there was like another one that was about a snowman as well, which I really loved. I just love Carol Ann Duffy's command of language. I think she uses it so cleverly. I do need to figure out how many of Carol Ann Duffy's collections I have left to read, because I think it might be almost done. And the final book I have to talk to you guys about is The Tradition by Jericho Brown. This is a poetry collection that has a lot to do with violence, both like physical and political. It has a lot to do with like the normalization of evil throughout history. What I find really impressive about Jericho Brown's writing is how they managed to combine like really intimate small moments with large scale political issues. And their poetry is also very much grounded in their experiences of being a person of colour and their sexuality. It's a book that has a lot to do with freedom and safety and what those things even mean. Definitely a poet who like I have to read some of their poems quite a few times to figure out what's going on, but like that's definitely not a criticism. I think they have one of the most interesting voices in poetry today. That's it. They are the books that I read in December. Apologies if some of these reviews were a bit too brief for you. Did want to try and get through all of the books in this video. I didn't want to split it into two. Leave me a comment down below if you read any of these books and let me know what you thought of them, or if not, let me know what your favourite read of December was. I hope you guys are having a brilliant day, and I will talk to you in my next video.